Straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We are all very proud of you and very grateful. You have added fresh luster to the fair name of your country and empire. The fame of your valor in Greece, Crete, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia will live in history.
The date was July the 12th, 1943, and the heroes, 5,239 soldiers, the first to return to New Zealand from the war in the Middle East.
One loved them for the fine, strong thing for which they stood. Loved them because they were New Zealanders and lifted high their country's name like a torch, whose light all men might see.
They were supposed to go back to the war after 3 months' leave, but only 900 of them did. More than half were soon to be found no longer fit for active service, and within 12 months, 407 had been court-martialed for desertion and then dishonorably discharged from the army. At the time, all reference to the matter was completely suppressed.
One of the commonest complaints of all frontline infantry is that they are doing all the fighting and carrying the brunt of the suffering, whilst in the rear echelons and at home there is a good deal of soft living, and there are a lot of people sitting around who've never heard a shot fired. And I think this is one of the factors that was very powerfully behind the whole affair of that first furlough draft.
The men who returned to New Zealand in July 1943 were some of the original volunteers, members of the first 3 echelons, which left New Zealand in 1940, before conscription was brought in. This had been their world for 3 years. During those 3 years, they'd seen 2 in every 5 of their comrades become war casualties. By 1943, those who'd been there the longest were war-torn and war-weary. Meanwhile, at home, pressure was steadily mounting for the return of the New Zealand Division from the war 10,000 miles away. The pressure had begun the previous year as a reaction to the threat posed by Japan, and it continued unabated into 1943. New Zealand's Prime Minister of the time was Labour's Peter Fraser, and for him it was a difficult political situation. Well known as a pacifist, he had to reflect the will of the people he represented, but at the same time honour pledges of support for Great Britain that he'd made at the beginning of the war. Eventually, the War Cabinet worked out a compromise solution, which had the approval of Winston Churchill, but which was to prove a disastrous mistake.
There was a great division of opinion, both in public and in Parliament, as to whether or not the division should stay in the Middle East or whether it should come back and fight in the Pacific. And the decision to come back was wrapped up in the decision to give the longest servicemen some home leave. Men who had been fighting for 3 years was felt was entitled to come home for a rest, 3 months, and then return.
In April 1943, Fraser cabled General Freyberg,
"There is the strongest feeling on the part of the people, Parliament and Government that those who have served in the 2nd NZDF the longest should be brought back on furlough, even if the division as a whole is not brought back."
A furlough scheme based on length of service was quickly worked out, and all those eligible were ordered to ballot for the right to 3 months' leave in New Zealand. On July the 15th, 1943, 5,239 men left Egypt in what was intended to be the first of an ongoing series of furloughs. The first furlough draft was codenamed Ruapehu. But already as they boarded the New Amsterdam for the return, they were confused about the furlough. Many thought they were coming home to stay, and the men of the Railway Construction and Maintenance Group were reinforced in that belief by incorrect instructions which had been given to them, as Freiburg was later to cable back to New Zealand. News that the railwaymen had been told they could stay in New Zealand if they wished spread quickly, adding to the confusion of the others. But there was another, deeper source of discontent. It was common knowledge that an election was due in New Zealand in September, and the return of 5,000 heroes at such an opportune time was suspect. For the first time, the men began to feel they were a political issue.
I thought personally then it was a political move. Most of the cabinet were pacifists, and I thought that they were trying to make good their ally to the people since the 1914-18 war, and the men coming back on furlough was to pacify, if you like, the people, and I thought it was wrong.
They arrived in Wellington on the 14th of July, a grey, wet winter's day. It was their first brush with normality after 3 years of madness.
Nobody, as far as I know, realized the effect that coming home would have on the soldiers who came home. They came back and had 3 months' leave, and during that period they had plenty of time to look around. Some of them were married, and lots, of course, would go back to their homes and their mothers. They would look around and see a different New Zealand from the one they left 3 years earlier.
The world that the furlough men returned to contrasted strongly with the one they'd come from. It was a world of peace. A year earlier, they would have seen and felt the tension of a community at risk of invasion. But the Japanese threat had disappeared after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and by mid-1943, New Zealand was comparatively relaxed and distant from the war. The people were concerned not with death and mutilation, but with pay packets, concerts, and all the pleasures of normal living.
Silk stockings mean much in a woman's life, and rightly so, in the fighting days of peace. But these are not the days of peace. Attractive as they may be, silk stockings are not essentials, but life will go on without them. Substitutes will be found. But aeroplane fabric and parachutes are essentials of modern war.
While New Zealand's war effort was being sustained, it was yet a vast change for the furlough men. They saw a widening gap between their own sacrifice as soldiers and the supportive role of those at home.
Those who believe that in the midst of the most frightful war in the world's history, civilian life can remain untroubled and unchanged, are living in a fool's paradise.
One factor influenced the behavior of the furlough men in the months to come beyond any other. They discovered that there were in New Zealand 38,000 fit and medically A1 men who'd not yet been to the war, men who were protected from conscription because they were employed in so-called essential industry.
I think they were quite justifiably outraged. They had been fighting for 3 years under desperate conditions, and they come back here and they find that the immediate threat which had affected New Zealand so gravely the year before, the threat of Japanese invasion had disappeared, and life appeared to be going on as usual. Men were in working in normal occupations, and they felt it was outrageous that they should be expected to go back and fight a second time, and other people in reserved occupations were still here, fit and able men. They resented this.
You'd meet somebody on the street, they shake hands, how are you? Pleased to see you back. And the next breath, when are you going back? Concerned that they may be called up to serve overseas.
In 1942, the war in the Pacific had threatened New Zealand with invasion by Japan. Now, in 1943, the returned soldiers couldn't help but feel that an invasion had taken place, albeit an invasion of a different sort. The American Marines were well paid and socially very successful, and long before the Ruapehu draft arrived in Wellington, they'd been a target for ill feeling. For the furlough men to meet them in the flesh was yet another in a growing list of irritants. By now, the men had become subject to a multitude of social and psychological pressures, pressures which more than set the stage for rebellion. The very day that they arrived in New Zealand, the Oamaru RSA was reported as recommending that they be allowed to stay here and not return to the war. The RSA said they should be replaced by fit men who'd not yet been overseas. The Oamaru report was immediately followed by editorial support in the Wellington Evening Star.
Apart from their distinguished service in the actual fighting, the men just back have long endured desert hardships, which now merit the reward of retention in New Zealand, if that is their own personal wish, and if fit men can be found, as they undoubtedly can, to replace them.
Almost immediately, newspaper editors throughout the country received instructions from the wartime chief censor, Mr. Joe Paul, who saw opportunities for enemy propaganda. The presence in New Zealand of soldiers on furlough now became an official secret. There the matter rested for the moment, as the Ruapehu men slowly readapted to life at home. Then, on August 29th, with the general election just a few weeks away, they were reminded of the political connotations of their return to New Zealand and of their impending departure again for the Middle East.
The issue had been exacerbated by the election. I remember Mr. Holland stating in his election broadcasts, and he breached the censor's ruling when he said that he didn't think any men should be sent twice until everybody had gone once.
Which in a sense let the cat out of the bag and opened up the whole matter for discussion. Sid Holland, as leader of the opposition, was in a privileged position, and it was very hard to control him.
By now, Prime Minister Peter Fraser had good cause to regret ever considering a furlough scheme. With an election looming, he was locked into an insoluble political argument that he could not win. To allow the men to remain in New Zealand would be as indefensible as forcing them to return to the Middle East. In fact, Cabinet had by now decided the matter, and Fraser had already communicated the decision to Freiburg for comment.
Oh, it was essentially a moral problem. I said that Fraser was influenced by the legal side, certainly, but it was the moral side that affected him more. And he certainly agonized over this decision.
Whatever decision that he made before the election would be open to very serious criticism. I mean, if he took a tough line, that would annoy a number of people. If he took a soft line, that would annoy other people. And I think any politician in these circumstances would stave off a decision as long as he possibly could, and try to focus the election on other issues.
The troops were to have gone back in October, but because of the government's anxiety not to announce a decision in the middle of the election campaign, arrangements for a troopship lapsed, And it wasn't for months afterwards that we got a troop ship to take these people back.
Labour won the election and 6 days later announced the long-withheld decision. Married men with children, men over 41, and curiously, Maoris would all be exempt from returning to the war. And
it was further provided that those men not in the exempted classes would be medically examined, and that those who were past medically fit would, unless they were granted leave, return to the Middle East at the expiration of their leave.
The issue immediately filled the correspondence columns of the newspapers.
The boys can always win attention and polite murmurs when they splash the local papers with a large casualty list, but when trying to get a fair deal for themselves, things are very different. There's a race meeting and tote figures to be attended to. Meanwhile, husky dodgers of essential industry live indeed in peace and security.
Exempted Grade 1 men working on farms should be replaced by returned soldiers, who would thus enjoy a respite from active service and still be substantial contributors to the country's production. This decision was reached at the annual meeting of the Makara Hutt Valley Provincial Executive of the New Zealand Farmers Union.
There was a great deal of public support for people who had made a tremendous sacrifice, and the public felt that the civilian community as a whole had been spared so much of what these people had gone through.
Mr. A. Horrobin said he felt that it was wrong to ask men to go back again after 3 years of fighting.
The inequality of sacrifice which they mention is outstanding, and surely the government will take notice of it.
In just 3 weeks, it became apparent to the government that this sort of publicity would severely affect the men's morale. Once again, the censor stepped in.
Dear Madam, I am sorry to say that for reasons over which we have no control, and which we are debarred from giving, it is now impossible to publish your or any other letter upon the return of the furlough men to the Middle East.
In the meantime, the promised medical examinations had begun.
My recollection now would be that there were perhaps 3 or 4 doctors, and they made particular inquiry in my case into the injury that I'd received, and they were understanding enough, I think, to perhaps have stretched the grade 1 that I was overseas so that it became grade 3 in New Zealand.
A very considerable number were downgraded medically after they came back, and there was a feeling that owing to the general state of the feeling in the community, the medical boards on the whole downgraded rather freely. They gave the men, shall we say, the benefit of the doubt if it was clear that they desperately did not want to go back.
They had left the Middle East as fit A1 soldiers, and General Freiberg had expected he might lose up to 2,000 men as a result of exemptions. Freiberg was astounded to learn that, in fact, 2,600, or 50% of the entire furlough draft, became exempt from returning on medical grounds alone. Altogether, just 1,600 men were still required to return to the war, 1,600 volunteers who saw themselves in a situation where they were being conscripted. For most, an unacceptable proposition. But by now, the 3 months' leave had stretched to 6 months, and many of the furlough men were well settled into civilian life. If their leave had remained at a strict 3 months, they might have shrugged off the pressures that militated against their return to the Middle East. By now, rebellion was inevitable. The first clear rejection by the men of the Army's authority occurred here, in the Hamilton Drill Hall, on the 5th of January 1944. By this time, furlough men throughout the country were united in their intention to insist on being replaced by A1 men who'd not yet been to the war. Senior NCOs had been approached for support and leadership, and the Minister of Defence had already been informed, unofficially, that the men would not go back to the Middle East. On December the 29th, 1943, a small group of furlough men who thought of themselves as the Council of Six convened a meeting of their comrades in a room on the first floor of the Hamilton Hotel. Their decision was to lead 7 days later to an act of direct disobedience.
We held a mass meeting, again by memory approximately 50, and with one dissenter, other than one dissenter I should say, they all agreed that we should defer our going back to camp as directed by the Army.
Several days before we were to assemble at the drill hall, the area officer told me about it, and he said they would not take any active part in it and they would keep right out of sight. I think they had the idea that their presence in the drill hall might make matters worse than what it was. So I knew I was going to be on my own there.
We received instructions from the Army to report to the drill hall in Hamilton at a certain time and date. We conformed to this and we paraded on the instruction from Major Plale. I was a marker on that parade.
I asked them to fall in the normal manner. I didn't order them onto parade, but they fell in the normal manner. And then one of them, I can't remember who it was, stepped forward and handed me this envelope which contained a letter of some sort, which afterwards, I believe, I gave to the area officer.
When Major Plale called us to attention, he gave us our instructions. And when he gave the order to a left wheel, myself as marker, which was prearranged, turned right.
Outside the drill hall, buses were waiting to take the men to Frankton railway station. Here they boarded a train carrying men from Auckland to military camps further south.
When the train came in, these chaps from Hamilton rushed along to the carriages and tried to persuade some of the other chaps on the train to get off. And some of them did leave the train too.
The Hamilton incident was the first act of defiance, but it was far from unexpected, either by the authorities or by furlough men elsewhere. The Hamilton Committee immediately sent telegrams around the country, while those still on board the train continued south, bearing the news to Waihuru, Linton and Trentham camps.
We got word through that the Papakura boys and others that were on the way down decided that they weren't going to go back. So we decided then to wait until they arrived in Palmerston at the railway station. We all met there on the station platform, and we had a few words there in the meeting, and it was unanimously decided then we'll return to our homes and see what action, you know, or what further would occur.
Well, my driver, he was a very decent young man, came to see me in my office, and he said, "I've come to tell you that I'm not going back." Since coming back, he'd looked around. There appeared to be a lot of able-bodied men walking the streets, getting good pay, and he didn't see why they shouldn't have a turn and let him take their place. That driver's predecessor had been killed in action just outside Tripoli, and another of my drivers had been killed in the 41 campaign, and yet another was to be wounded a little later. I told him that I was sorry to hear that he didn't want to go back, and I couldn't help feeling a little sympathy for him, but I couldn't express it. I told him that I thought it was his duty to go back.
On the 7th of January, a telegram of 147 words was sent to all those who'd stayed away from camp. Many, in fact, had gone to camp in the first place, aware that their rebellion was now being organized by senior NCOs inside each camp. Soon, activities were coordinated by telephone, with the unofficial help of telephone operators in every center. It was decided as a matter of policy that the men would obey all legal orders except one, the order to embark for the Middle East. This alone they would refuse to obey. The policy was successfully carried out in every camp except Linton, where 37 men refused all orders. They were later tried for, but not convicted, of mutiny. Now, Prime Minister Peter Fraser had the painful job of deciding what to do about them.
One meeting I do recall in War Cabinet took place between the Representatives' Army and the ministers. And I do remember Mr. Fraser going around the room asking each of them in turn whether they thought it would be possible to get the men to go back. General Patrick, I recall quite clearly, was very definite in his opinion that it wasn't on, for the simple reason that he didn't have the armed force to put them back. This body of men was too large to coerce, and the discussion went on around the room, and one of the senior brigadiers didn't agree and said he thought it would be possible that the men could be persuaded to go back and measures could be taken to get them to return. And I think that that intervention weighed a great deal with Fraser and led him to the decision that an attempt should be made to get the men to go back.
The Honourable Fred Jones, the Minister for Defence at that time, asked me to accompany him and to speak to the troops. And I can remember going to two of the camps, one of which I'm sure was Linton, and I think the other might have been Waihuru. And I spoke to them on the lines that they were veterans, they were trained soldiers, and they were the chaps whom I thought General Freyberg wanted back in the division. I found it difficult to find any other arguments except that they had, in fact, enlisted for the duration of the war.
Visits to Trentham and Linton camps by the Minister of Defence Fred Jones and senior army officers resulted in concessions being made to the men. All whose wives were pregnant, those who were by now known as the pregnant fathers, could remain in New Zealand for the meantime. There was also to be another medical examination. The result, a further 244 exemptions. On the 9th of January, embarkation parades were held in each camp.
Yes, well, of course, time dims your memory, but I can remember a big parade that we had, where we were all asked or explained the position as it stood. We were determined to stand on the fact that, on principle, that we weren't going back until something was done about those chaps that were eligible to go back, but in essential industry. But on the parade, they gave us the opportunity of saying yes or no. Those that said yes were marched off and away they went. The rest of us went back to the barracks, I think it was C block, from memory.
Altogether, 680 men obeyed the embarkation order. The train carrying furlough men from Auckland to Wellington to embark was boarded at Hamilton by a local accountant who went from carriage to carriage attempting to persuade the men to remain in support of the rebels. He was arrested at Taihape and later prosecuted, unsuccessfully, for sedition. It was the only incident in the whole Ruapehu affair to be used as propaganda by the enemy. In France, on the 5th of May, German-controlled Radio Paris broadcast, "There has been a mutiny among the troops due to embark for the European front from Hamilton. A state of siege has been proclaimed in the town." Still in camp were nearly 1,000 rebels, of whom 240 were willing to return to the war, but remained on principle to support their comrades. Only Waihuru remained trouble-free. Within 6 weeks, 800 men in every other camp in the country were court-martialed for desertion and sentenced to 90 days in prison.
My memories of the trial are going up in groups. I think there was 3 or 4 in a group. And we were taken in groups. The charges read out. And witnesses were brought in from Burnham camp. But apart from that, I remember we sat dumb, from what I can remember, and wouldn't answer any charges.
None of the sentences were ever to be carried out. But there was an attempt at Burnham selectively to imprison one man, a highly decorated warrant officer and the leader of the furlough men.
He was called into Army headquarters, and there was a passageway leading to the fire office. And when he walked in there, the redcaps were lined up on either side, and they just closed in on him, and they whipped him away somewhere out of Christchurch.
See, I knew I was going to be arrested because I'd been told I would be before I ever was. We had people that were working in the telephone exchange. We had ones that were working in the army headquarters, camp headquarters, and also ones working in the officers' mess. That everything that occurred as far as the officers were concerned at night, what they discussed about the furlough draft, came back to us.
I think they felt that without him that we may have, or a majority of them, or a number of them, may have changed their minds on the decision they'd made to stay behind.
The attempt to deprive the men of their leader ended here, in central Christchurch, after the men had confronted the camp authorities and insisted that they be given transport. They made threats which forced the authorities to yield and then rushed into Christchurch, blocking off Hereford Street in front of Army headquarters and demanding their leader.
We dashed into the transport yard, or part of the establishment, and took these vehicles, and away we went to Christchurch headquarters. Blocked off a street, and of course demanded, in raucous voices and so forth, that our speaker be returned.
If I hadn't have been returned to Christchurch, they would have taken over the army headquarters, the whole of army headquarters in the city of Christchurch, the whole of the barracks, and then would have demonstrated right through, and even if it had to be, gone to Wellington. They would have got in touch with Trentham and Papakura to really demonstrate properly on it.
When I got to Hereford Street Defence Headquarters, there were lorries there, and there were numbers of the men, some on the pavement and some still in, and as I came to them, they gathered round, and they said, "Well, we want our grievance submitted to high authority." Very well, I said, that's a reasonable proposition. Whereupon, I think, speaking from memory, and almost at once, I got through to Wellington, spoke to the representative of Cabinet, told them what the situation was, and I think shortly afterwards, I got a ring back to say that the request would receive favourable consideration, would be notified of an appropriate time. I arranged the meeting in the War Cabinet, and Watson, who was the advocate for the men, and half a dozen of the principal men involved, the spokesmen, came up. They were ushered into War Cabinet. The meeting was an amicable one. Fraser was conciliatory. He listened to the men very carefully. They were impressed with the men, and they were saddened by the whole experience, but felt they couldn't do anything else but go ahead.
I addressed Fraser in the War Cabinet, and I told them these various instances of grade 1 men in these so-called essential industries that were sitting in New Zealand, living on the best and luxury, that we were deprived of for 3 years, and we wished to take their place. I also put it to him that we were volunteers in the War Cabinet, or most of the War Cabinet were conscientious objectors, and on the ground that they were against war. And here they were sending us back to war. Surely that was against their principles. I put it to him that if he sent these men back, or the majority of the men back who wanted to stay behind, they'd never return, they would be killed, because their nerve had gone, and once they refused to go, then they were no good as a soldier in the front line, where other lives depended on them. The only reply he made to me was, "Well, we know you're right, but you've got to return. Freyberg's requested your return."
The meeting with the War Cabinet took place on the 26th of February. 6 weeks later, 187 men from Trentham Camp came to Wellington by train and staged a march on Parliament. They carried banners reading, "We fight for 1,000 furlough men." It was their only way to inform the public of what was going on. The whole issue had been under official censorship since October, and not a word about the rebellion was printed in any newspaper. Meanwhile, the court-martial verdicts on the desertion charges were being tested here in the Wellington Supreme Court. Counsel for the men had taken the highly unusual step of appealing the military court decision in the Civil Court of Appeal.
The men were charged with desertion of the armed service, of His Majesty's service. And they were charged at a court-martial which was held in Trentham military camp. This was presided over by many senior officers because it was a very serious charge. Shortly before this, of course, desertion was punishable. Desertion in time of war was punishable by death. And even at this time, it was an offence which was punishable by penal servitude for life. So when it was over, Mr. Watson conducted the court-martial with me as I acted as his junior. It was decided that we should appeal to the civil courts. And this was done by an application for what they call a writ of certiorari, to quash the finding of the court-martial. It was a technical point. The question was shortly whether men who at that particular time had reported back from duty, for duty and were in the Trentham military camp under military discipline, had actually deserted the army. And it was held that this didn't work. They could have been charged with several other offences, refusing to obey an order, for example. In certain circumstances, if you had a combination of men refusing to obey an order, it may even amount to insubordination or mutiny. But it wasn't desertion, because they were still in the service of His Majesty and being paid by His Majesty. And it was quashed. Now, there were several, one or two interesting, perhaps, sidelights on it. The army, rightly or wrongly, I may confess that it surprised us very greatly, decided to make a compulsory military parade. So the whole 300 men, or thereabouts, were marched into out of camp, to a train, and at Wellington Station they were marched to the Supreme Court of Wellington. Maybe it was thought that they should be present at their trial. But we had these 300 men. I always remember Mr. Watson, when I went down on the morning of the trial, the first day, saying to me as I was starting to row, "Have you had a look at the Supreme Court number 1 court?" And I said, "No." He says, "You've never seen such a sight in your life." He says, "They're hanging from the chandeliers." So when we got in, we saw this mass of people, army men who wouldn't know what it was all about. They certainly knew they'd been convicted of desertion. We were trying to upset it. But it was essentially a legal argument. And these fellows had to sit through 3 days of this. There was a guard outside the main gates. They brought along under armed guard. Well, he said if they've got to sit through it, they've got to sit through it. But he said perhaps you could get the committee chaps to perhaps arrange them in a certain way. So we arranged so that the men that probably looked a little more alive than others, and certainly the ones that had decorations in the way of ribbons, we managed to get them to the front row. We thought, well, if they're going to make this parade, we'll see that it's the best possible advantage.
The Wellington appeal quashed the court-martial convictions of all the furlough men. But the issue was not yet quite finished. On the 20th of June 1944, 450 men were, by gazette, dismissed from the forces for misconduct and insubordination. On July the 26th, another 140 men of the second furlough draft were also dismissed. The publicity given by the Gazette was unavoidable, and the newspapers were requested not to mention the matter. The newspapers were also instructed not to mention the activities of the furlough men, nor the action taken against them, and nothing about the demonstrations, court-martials or penalties was revealed to the public of New Zealand until the censorship lapsed after the war. Further penalties were imposed along with the dishonourable discharges. The War Cabinet decreed that the men dismissed would lose all their rehabilitation benefits, their deferred pay, and any gratuity that might be granted after the war. It was also decided that the men would be banned from employment in the public service. In addition, although the Returned Services Association had supported and argued the case of the furlough men from the beginning, after they were dishonourably discharged, the RSA decided to refuse to admit them to membership.
I came back with the furlough itself and became a member of the RSA in Paiatu, and I remember this coming up at a meeting, and I got up and spoke very vehemently because the men weren't going to be accepted into the RSA because they hadn't got an honourable discharge. Yet there were men who had gone away, had become prisoners of war, others had given their lives, and these men had done exactly the same thing. And I thought it was an absolute injustice.
Slowly, news of the plight of the Ruapehu men spread by word of mouth, and on August the 2nd, this petition was presented to Parliament. It was signed by 3,000 Wellington women and urged that the penalties imposed on the furlough men be lifted. The following year, 4 days after the surrender of Japan, Peter Fraser announced the restoration to the men of all their rehabilitation privileges. At the same time, the RSA annual conference decided to admit the men to membership.
Well, the whole episode illustrates, to my mind, the difference between legal powers, which theoretically you can do such and such, and the practical situation, which limits your exercise of legal powers, so that you might have the legal power to inflict a whole range of penalties on people like the furlough men, but in practice you found that that just simply could not be done. You inflict a whole series of penalties and gradually you reduce them and ultimately perhaps wash out the whole thing, because you have to keep in step with the sentiment of the community as a whole.
You can see it as evidence of the democratic spirit and something more than that, the ability to think for oneself. And this, of course, is one of the characteristics of the two NZEF formations. They had a fantastically high morale, and some of that is due to the fact that the individual soldier is not just a puppet, he's not just a piece of cannon fodder, he is a thinking individual.
They were ordinary guys who had responded to what you might call the call of duty or the national need of the time, but they didn't altogether surrender their customary feelings of independence. They retained very much civilian attitudes towards things that they thought were civilian matters.
The Ruapehu Rebellion resulted in a change of policy. Only one more draft was returned to New Zealand on furlough. It was codenamed Wakatipu, and its members became embroiled in the same argument, with the same results. After that, it was decided to discontinue the furlough scheme, and in future, all soldiers who returned to New Zealand after long service in the Middle East or Europe were officially coming home permanently, to be replaced by reinforcements.
We should have had a replacement scheme right from the beginning, although it's easy to look back now and be wise about it all.
If the authorities had sent us, say, to UK, South Africa, Australia, I think things would have turned out all right. But we should not have been returned to New Zealand on such a prolonged furlough.
The contract was too tough in human terms.
Ironically, on the 23rd of January 1944, a month before the court-martials took place, Winston Churchill had written to the Dominion Secretary, "I have always wanted the New Zealand Division to take part in the Battle of Rome, more as a symbol than because we cannot find other troops. I should not ask Mr. Fraser to run into any serious difficulties about the return of particular individuals."